Most people don't get things done. Most people aren't productive, but today I have the solution for you. Not me, but actually my guest is a grand master on productivity. His name is David Allen. He has worked on this topic for decades and has written an international bestseller called Getting Things Done. So David, let me ask you one of the most important questions right at the beginning. What are the common 2-3 reasons why most people don't get things done?
They don't define what doing means and what done means.
Right. Sounds very crisp and sharp. How would you define what doing means and what things are and what done means?
Let's call done. What commitment do you have and when is it finished? That's called done. Gee, I want to have this tooth fixed. I need a vice president of marketing hired in our company. I need to decide whether we should adopt or not. Those are the kinds of things that have people's attention, but most people have not sat down and decide, okay, I get to mark this off as done when what's true. So that's the lack of the done definition, which is one of the key elements of why people aren't getting them done. They don't know what done means. They haven't gotten really clear about what done means. And then the second thing is, well, what would doing look like if right now you were trying to, what's the next thing you need to do about figuring out whether you should adopt or not, or hire a vice president or not, or fix your tooth or not? What's the very next thing you need to do? And most people avoid the decision about what does doing look like relative to the done things I'm committed to do. So, and in a way, Vlad, come on, this is the zeros and ones of productivity. What's the outcome you're after? What's the allocation or reallocation of resources you need to make sure that happens? And most people avoid those like the plague. So that's the biggest reason.
I'm not in the field of productivity, but whenever I talk to someone about productivity, the most common questions that pops up with my clients is, what is actually important? And I ask this question to you because I'm wondering what your response could be. Everybody knows, or most people know, this Eisenhower matrix where you define super important and urgent tasks, just important, just urgent, and stuff like that.
And all those are useful, but ultimately you have to decide, why are you on the planet? How are you doing as a human being? Why are you here? What's your purpose? What are your really core values? What really matters to you? Have you defined that? If you haven't defined that, you'd be banging around for a while till you sort of figure that out. And by the way, what was your vision of you fulfilling that purpose successfully in the next 3 to 5 years? Have you defined that? If you haven't, you'll still be banging around till you figure that one out. And then you say, well, what do you need to make sure you get accomplished over the next, 1 to 2 years to make sure your vision happens? Goals, objectives, at that level of game. If you haven't figured that out, well, you'll still be banging around until you have to figure that out. And then you have, what are all the things you need to manage and maintain so that you can get there? Your health, your vitality, your relationships, your fun factor, your finances, your tech. What are all the things you need to manage and maintain? And oh, by the way, what are all the things you need to finish about any of that I just said? How many projects do you have? What are the outcomes that you're committed to complete? Get my tooth fixed, hire the vice president, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, what are all the things you need to do about any of the open loops that I just identified? Most people have between 100 to 200 next actions right now in terms of meetings you need to go to about that, agendas you need to draft, conversations you need to have with a life partner, websites you need to surf, things you need to buy at the store, et cetera. So I couldn't get it any simpler than that, Vlad, but there were 6 levels of commitments that I said, well, we've all got those, whether you're conscious about them or not, but they're the ones who drive, well, what should you do? Most people have no clue because they have no clue of how many things they haven't done and how many commitments they actually have. So a lot of our work is simply getting people clear about what their current commitments are, and then they figure that out. It's not hard once they get a sense of getting out. Your head is just such a crappy office. That's the problem. Most people are trying to manage their life in their head, and it just didn't evolve to do that very well. So once we get them to externalize all those things, what has your attention? Well, what are you going to do about it? Is that something you need to take action on? What's the outcome you're committed to? So you're not born answering these questions and having that questionable process built in to your psyche or to your cognitive muscle. So you know how to think about what does that email mean to me? Most emails don't show up telling you exactly what you need to do about them or what your next step is. You have to figure that out. So I just figured out what the figure out mechanism is and algorithm. And then and most people don't do that because, again, you're not born doing it. It's not a natural thing. People do it, semi-consciously just to get where they are. It's what you said is really not true. People actually get things done. Otherwise they wouldn't be listening or watching us right now. So people actually get things done. I just figured out what you do to get things done with as little effort as possible to make sure you get the right things done, to get the appropriate amount of conscious space to make sure you're making good conscious decision.
Mm-hmm. You have an interesting sentence in your book. Maybe it's even my favorite sentence of the whole book. You write that people think a lot, but most of the time they think of a problem, not about a problem. Could you
Correct.
interpret that beautiful sentence for our listeners?
Well, most people are being reminded about stuff they still need to think about. So thinking about is what your mind is for. Oh, well, let me see. Here are all the things we need to potentially think about on this trip to Japan. My wife and I are going to Japan in a few days. Here are all the things we might need to think about. So that's what your mind is for. So here's all the things you need. What I don't want to do is have to keep rethinking any of that. I don't want to have to keep thinking of trip to Japan. I want to be thinking about it. If I think of it, I think, well, what do I need to do to get Japan off my mind? And then that's where I need to make decisions about, okay, here's what we need to do next, or here's where we need to go, or here's what we need to buy, or here's what we need to check, or here's who we need to talk to, etc. So there's thinking about your stuff is what you're about. That's reflective time. Let me think about that. Wow. Here's a way we could address this. Here's a way we could address this. Thinking of it means that there are things that showed up while you were thinking about it you didn't capture, so that you keep thinking of it instead of letting your mind be free to think more about it in bigger and more expanded ways.
Yeah, I thought that was a really nice sentence that captures most of people's lives, because most of the time, in my experience, people think about a problem. For instance, they have a big fight with their parents or with their boss, and then they think about the thing that might come up next week when they see each other again, but they don't really think about the next action steps that they should take in order to maybe manage that conflict. Another sentence that I really liked in your book is the sentence, you must use your mind to get things off your mind. That sounds a little philosophical, so maybe you can help us there. What does it mean to use my mind to get things off my mind?
Do you have pets? Do you have a cat or a dog?
Not yet.
Well, if you wanted to have a pet or a dog, should we get a dog? If you want to get that off your mind, you have to decide, well, what do you need to do? What do you need to decide so that some part of you doesn't have to keep thinking about that? Oh, I need to talk to my life partner. Oh, I should check in to what it takes to get a dog, or I need to do whatever. So there's thinking you haven't finished about stuff. So you need to think, you need to use your mind to be thinking outcome and action about the stuff that has your attention. And another, saying I have is you need to think about your stuff more than you think, but less than you are afraid of. A lot of people are not thinking about it because, oh God, if I start to think about that, there's too much to think about, I quit, but it's still on their mind. So they haven't thought about it enough. And it doesn't mean you need to finish it. Doesn't mean you need to have a total, Excel spreadsheet, Gantt chart, critical path, plan about any of this. You need to make sure, well, wait a minute. What's it? What is it that I want to do? And what's the next step I need to take? And that requires thinking. Those do not show up automatically. They did when you were pre-knowledge worker world back in the 150 years ago, where your work was just you show up and there's unmade, unmoved things. You just need to, okay, here's the things I need to make, here's the things I need to move. So the work told you what to do. Now, given the great, and late Peter Drucker, who defined knowledge work, where you actually have to think to figure out what am I going to do about this email? What do I do about getting a dog or not? What do I do about this? And that still requires some thinking. That's not going to show up automatically. You actually have to engage your thinking process. Not a lot, And a lot of people avoid thinking because they're afraid there's too much thinking to do. Not true.
And speaking about thinking, that's probably one of the hardest things people can do. That's why people avoid or try to avoid thinking as much
thinking
as
is tough. Ask anybody who writes. Thinking is tough. I avoid thinking. I got to sit down and write a foreword to this thing, or I need to come up with some new repurposing of an essay that I need to rewrite or thing. I was like, oh God, okay. I actually am going to have to think. And your cognitive muscle of that kind of thinking, you only got about 4 hours a day max before your brain fries out. So it actually is a cognitive muscle that you need to train.
I think there is even a beautiful quote by Henry Ford. He said something along the lines, thinking is one of the hardest things there is. That's why so few people engage in it.
Of course. Most people think that they're thinking, but what they're doing is reiterating and reverberating, thoughts they've already had, about stuff.
Recycling.
Yeah. Well, be nice if it was just recycling, but it's not. It's reverberating or reiterating or repeating. And, that's just a big drain of energy.
Another thing that happened to me while I was reading your book was I was thinking about Bruce Lee. Do you know why?
Mind like water. His sensei, sort of coined that idea, or at least gave that to Bruce. It's kind of like, here's where your power is. Water looks like it's not powerful, but it is if you really understand how water works. And the whole thing was, you need to have a clear head. You need to be present. So there's a lot of current terms you could use to reiterate that. But I loved it because I got a black belt in karate when in my 20s, so I was familiar with the idea. Mm-hmm. And it's a great idea. And it's like when you're jumped by 4 people in a dark alley that surprise you, you don't want 2,000 unprocessed emails somehow hanging around your psyche that prevent you from being present, current. Okay, now with that. And what's interesting, Vlad, is there's been a lot of research that says, gee, it takes you 20 minutes to refocus on something at work when you get interrupted. I go, excuse me, ask a martial artist how long it takes them to refocus when 4 people jump them. Get real. You can shift focus really fast as long as you don't have residue from the previous focus that's keeping you from being present with the next one. So that's why being present and current doesn't mean that you have to. It just means you need to make sure that you don't have any residue with any thinking you're doing. It then makes you available very quickly to do something else. So the whole idea of being able to shift focus, that's going to be a requirement for everybody these days. Come on. How many times did your parents have to rethink what they were doing with their lives? How many times have you, Vlad, had to rethink what you're doing with your life? Right. So they're same kind of questions. It's just they could get under cruise control a lot longer than you could. Right.
Yeah. And speaking of studies, you mentioned one about refocusing that it takes 20 minutes. I read another study that tried to measure how much time people are actually present for instance, during our conversation, really listening to us, and how much time people thought other things, for instance, do my laundry, call my colleague, and so on. And the result that in the study that I read was that 47% people are listening, are really present. So the probability that the people that listen to this interview for, let's say, 45 minutes, probably they were with us around 20 or 25. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. Then most of them have already had their mind go many places other than what you and I've been talking about. So for sure, it's the same thing. And your mind is just such a crappy office because, first of all, if your mind is the only place that's keeping track of something that you need to keep track of, it has no sense of past or future. So it will remind you about buying cat food at 3 o'clock in the morning when you can't go buy cat food at 3 o'clock in the morning. Because it just shows up at random times when these things you've parked inside this thing that has no sense of past or future. It doesn't care about your priorities or about your timing. It just says, here's a, oh yeah, here's something. And it just, it pops in, just ad hoc. And so, I just discovered 40 years ago, how do you get rid of the ad hoc? Makes life a lot simpler and a lot easier.
So what would be your advice for a person that really is struck by our conversation, that people are absent most of the time? What would you recommend to them? For instance, many people don't have this thing live, and you're showing that, your capturing system. So could you explain why people should capture their spontaneous thoughts? And explicitly during our conversation, what should people do? Imagine somebody is in the bus listening to this as an audio podcast, and now he has this idea he has to call his mom. What's the best way to capture, where to capture, and when to capture?
I've had this for 40 years because some of my coolest ideas show up in the weirdest moments and times and spaces. So, you need some ubiquitous capture tool wherever you are thinking about stuff. And now you've got 50,000 ideas a day or thoughts a day, so you don't need to capture 50,000 things. You couldn't do that. What are the things you think about that you might say, or that you say, I might need to decide or do something about that? Whether that's a restaurant people recommend or some big idea you have about life or work that you need to do, that you need to capture whenever it shows up, because the muse is fickle. She shows up and it will be gone, and you'll forget what you forgot about quickly. So the whole idea is to build a habit of capturing. So that's the first probably critical behavior or practice that people need to engage in and habitualize to keep their head clear. It's like, well, what pops into your head that you might still need to do something about, so your head doesn't have to think of it again. And so you need some sort of universal capture tool. Mine are low tech because I don't need batteries or Wi-Fi. I don't need any clicks. I don't need to turn anything on to get those out of my head. Now, that's not my organization system. Those things are just raw data, much like mail that shows up in your mailbox. And then I throw all those notes into my in tray if I don't process them right away. And then I go through the stage 2. Once I've captured, then I need to clarify it. What is that? What am I going to do about that, if anything? And then step 3 is, where do I organize a reminder if I can't finish it right now? Step 4 is to make sure that I then look at the list that I've created. The errands I need to run. Here's the stuff I need to talk to my life captain. So, that's why I just uncovered or objectified how we get stuff under control. You need to capture stuff that has your attention about it. You need to clarify what the things are that you need to do about it. And then you need to organize reminders of those things and put the things in appropriate places. So that then step 4, the reflection process, is you step back and take a look at all that and go, and then step 5, okay, now I'm comfortable about what I'm doing and what I'm not doing. So right. I didn't make that up. I just identified it. But very few people are really doing that. They're doing that to some degree all the time, just to stay conscious and stay somewhat current with their lives. But very few people are really, really, really doing that, which gives you a really, really, really clear head, no matter how busy you are.
So, David, my next question is many people have big trouble of getting started. So, when they identify the thing that they should do and even identify the first step of doing it, going to the gym or asking for a raise, oftentimes they are afraid to do it. So, maybe you could talk about how people could really get started in getting the things done that they identified. What's a good way to start the thing that you should do?
Well, first of all, what most people think is the next step is not the next step. Oh, well, we need to figure out X as a next step. Yeah, how do you figure that out? You need to surf a website, you need to talk to a friend, you need to talk to your partner. So most people haven't gotten down really to the very next granular physical visible action that they need to take. And those are not hard to do. And you don't have to figure out the whole thing to decide what the next thing is I need to get moving on it. And most people just avoid moving because they haven't truly defined what moving looks like and where it happens. Does it happen at your computer? Does it happen at your wife or your husband? Does it happen at your, and if you haven't, most people just are not that granular in their thinking. And so that's probably the biggest reason people avoid it. And there's also other reasons. You'll tend to avoid things that are closest to your soul, closest to who you really are. You're going to tend to avoid that because it's going to scare the heck out of you to get in moving on that. What if you were really successful about that? Oh my God, And so I'm not willing to take that risk. And so there are a lot of other spiritual, psychological, emotional reasons that people may avoid hopping into things that they think they should or ought to or could do. And so, my methodology doesn't address that other than it addresses, so what do you think your issue is and what would you need to do about that?
Mm-hmm. And one concept in your book that many people find really useful when they review your book, for instance, is the weekly review, to have a look at what you have done. I think if people are really honest, they will confirm that they do not do it, although it looks like common sense. Oftentimes when we do a task, we review a task. When we do a project, we review a project. But after we have done the week, we don't review the week. So how does this process of reviewing the week work? And why should we definitely do that week review?
Well, you need to get closure. What open loops happened during this week? What went on? And it's always nice to acknowledge what you actually completed and did. That's a good thing to do, is to say, yeah, hey, cool. We finished that. Oh, that reminds me, I still need to X, Y, Z. And that's where the real weekly review comes in. It's like getting yourself sort of rewired for how to approach the next week or two. See, a lot of people listening and watching this right now have had things show up in the last, probably even this week. You say, oh God, there's stuff I need to do about that or something I need to handle about that, but I haven't had time to stop and figure out what exactly that is and what I need to do about it. And that's where the review process is not just reviewing what's on your list. Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, what have you finished that you can mark off as done? And what meetings were you in that you need to still clarify stuff that you committed to do about anything in those meetings? And that's a lot of what the weekly review is. It's not just a static process. It's a very creative process where you sit down and kind of reflect on what's happened and where I'm going and how to locate myself again in space and time, given my commitments. So it's a very powerful process, and probably one of the hardest habits for people to engage in regularly or to install, simply because I don't have time to do a review. I'm too busy. Right. And that's probably one of the biggest things missing in the mid to senior level professionals levels anyway, is reflection time. What happened? What do I need to do about that? What do I need to capture and decide and figure out and organize about, what went on in the board meeting or what went on in my tough meeting I had with my assistant. And, those are the kinds of reflection processes that most people avoid like the plague until they just all mount up at some point, and then you feel overwhelmed in your life. So at some point, now, life happens to us and we move too fast to do that every minute, every day. But every 7 days or so, you need to catch up and bring up the rear guard and just make sure that you get more current. So where you are, you're able to engage with things with a lot more presence.
The most surprising part of your book, towards the end, you actually are talking about negative feelings, negative emotions. Normally, when people talk about productivity, they talk about techniques, do this, prioritize this way. And I found it very valuable that you also talk about negative feelings like, for instance, guilt or anxiety, because being productive, we're not machines, is not just changing the algorithm to have a better output, but during this process, we feel things, and that's obvious to us, but maybe what's not obvious to many of us is a sentence that I have heard from Tony Robbins that I also really like, and it goes like this: the quality of our emotions determines the quality of our life. So wherever we are in our life, we can be a bus driver, but feeling good about that and really have a wonderful life, or be a CEO who's also always anxious not to meet certain criteria, not to meet certain numbers, and feeling shitty and guilty all the time. And in this alternative, I would definitely prefer to be a bus driver that really likes the challenge of driving people, bringing people safe to wherever they want to go. So my question to you, and after having this book, I have an idea about that, but what is the connection between anxiety, fear, or maybe even guilt, and being productive or maybe not so productive? What's the connection there?
Well, your emotions are driven much more by your thinking than the other way around. So I would disagree with Tony if that's all he said. I'm sure he'd probably agree with me. I know each other. But how you think much more affects how you feel. Now, how you feel is going to affect how you think, but I guarantee you how you think is going to affect a lot more in a stable way how you feel. So many times I'm feeling guilty, or I'm feeling anxiety, feeling about what? And you need to then start to move your mind to go, why? Why are you feeling that? What do you need to do? What's the outcome you're after? What's the next step you might need to take to resolve that or to get rid of that? So again, you've got to think about your stuff more than you think, but less than you're afraid of. So, I don't deal with the emotions. I know how emotional things are for people, and I have them too, but I just know they go up and down, and they're a lot more fluid and flexible and changeable than you're thinking. So how do I think? What do I need to think about this situation? See, the problem is if you've got one situation that's out of control that you don't feel comfortable about or appropriately engaged with, it'll make your whole life feel gray, make your whole life feel like you're overwhelmed. Because we can't figure out whether to get divorced or not, or we can't figure out what we're going to do about this issue that showed up that might put us into bankruptcy. We can't figure out. And that one thing will color your whole life, make you feel totally overwhelmed about your life, as opposed to, okay, so what do you need to do about that situation? What's your desired outcome? What's the next step you need to take? So I don't have the patience to deal with people's emotions. Mm-hmm. Come on, they're going to change in a second if we can get you to think about the right things you need to think about.
Yeah. And the nice idea that you had in the book is also that many negative emotions like guilt comes actually from the fact that you are not following the agreements with yourself, that you're breaking the agreements with yourself. For instance, because you said yes too many times, yes to Robert, yes to Jane, yes to your boss, and suddenly you have too much to do and you cannot do it because you also have a wife, you have a daughter and stuff like that. So could you give us at the end a tip how we can break less agreements with ourselves?
First of all, you need to know what agreements you've made. It's like you have a credit card and you don't keep track of the balance, you'll overspend. Right? So if you don't keep track of your agreements, you will overcommit. Never seen an exception. So keep track of them all, and then they'll make you more. You see, I'm an approval guy. I hate to have people. I hate to say no to anybody. So I love to, come on, Vlad, what do you need? I would love to do that, but because I know how much stuff I have on my plate, and that's all a conscious, inventory that I have, I go, Well, that's such a cool idea. But right now I don't have the inventory of time to be able to put the attention to that it probably deserves. So learning how to have those kinds of elegantly political conversations, is only available once you know what you really have to do.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually, to end our interview, the beauty of your subtitle. It's not just getting things done, but also the art of stress-free productivity. And I think that's the beauty of it. It's not just about getting things done, but getting things done while you're not feeling guilty, not anxious, and not feeling stressed. So, dear community, I strongly recommend this book. That's, of course, available in German, obviously. And in how many other languages, David?
28, 30, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, so I'm sure everybody who has listened that far will find this book in the respective language. Strong recommendation. You will find the link in the description below. David, one last tip or one last hint for our viewers belongs to you.
Your mind's for having ideas, not for holding them.
Perfect. David, thanks a lot. And if you're not subscribed yet to my channel, please do so below this video. And I see you again soon. Goodbye.